Good morning. Before I invite Mr. McIntosh to lead, I think Ms. Cairns is the witness this
Dr.
morning. Can I say something about Direction 11? Now, Direction 11 proposed a change in timetable in relation, in particular, to the submission of closing statements. Now, the intention was to provide legal representatives with further time, but I immediately accept that that failed to take into account counsel's other professional commitments. Now, I understand informal representations have been made to counsel to the inquiry, which he has passed on to me. I see the force of these representations immediately, and what we will do is to revert to the previous timetable, which counsel will quite reasonably have constructed their as I say, professional commitments around. Direction 11 is no longer on the website, and matters will be formalized probably in a further direction. But I regret any concerns that may have been raised by that. The purpose was a good purpose, but as with many good purposes, they have other consequences. So the short point is we will revert to the timetable set out in Direction 10, although that will be stated more formally, probably in a further direction. Now, can I turn to Mr. McIntosh and invite him to lead Ms. Cairns as our witness this morning?
Thank you, Brian.
Good morning, Ms. Cairns. Now, understand you're prepared to affirm. Sitting where you are, can I ask you to repeat these words after me? I solemnly, sincerely, and truly
I solemnly, sincerely, and truly
declare and affirm
that
I will tell the truth,
I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
and
nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much, Ms. Cairns. I don't know how long your evidence will take. It's scheduled for the morning. It may or may not take the whole morning. We usually have a coffee break at about 11:30. If for any reason you want to take a break, just give me an indication and we will take a break. Can I encourage you perhaps to speak a little louder than you would in normal conversation? The room's quite large. You have the microphones, but it's particularly with detailed evidence. It's very important that we hear exactly what you have to say. So if I could ask you, as I say, maybe just to project a little more than you would in normal conversation. No, Mr. McIntosh.
Thank you, my lord. Ms. Cairns, I wonder if I can take your full name.
Shona Cairns.
And you produced a statement.
I did.
Are you willing to adopt it as part of your evidence?
I am.
Thank you. Now, what I first want to do is just to look at your statement on page 10 of the statement bundle and just discuss your professional qualifications. We can clearly read them in full, but you describe yourself as a consultant healthcare scientist / epidemiologist.
That's
so
correct.
how did you come to become one of those? What's the career path to get to be?
So I've actually worked for the previous guises of our High Scotland for 22 years. So I started, so I'm a scientist by background. I've got a degree in immunology and pharmacology. So I first started in our High as a data manager. And whilst I was working in RHI, they supported me to undertake a master's in epidemiology. So I have a master's in epidemiology. We've got a really good career framework pathway within RHI Scotland where you can progress through the various roles. So now I'm a consultant healthcare scientist. To be able to do that, I had to undertake clinical science registration. So I'm a registered healthcare scientist with the Health and Care Professions Council, which is a similar council to the GMC and NMC. So I'm bound by the sort of areas of practice and ethics around that. So that's how I've got to consultant healthcare scientist.
Now, you mentioned that you're the clinical lead within RHI for it says in your statement, for the HCAISE clinical program and data intelligence team.
Yeah.
We've obviously dealt with a lot of RHI documentation in this inquiry. Could you give us a broad understanding of what that team does? As we go through, I may well ask you, is your team, in a sense, corporately responsible for this document or that document?
Yeah, so there's sort of two aspects to it. So the clinical programme is, which is called the Healthcare Associated Infection Surveillance and Epidemiology Programme. That programme is responsible for producing national level epidemiological evidence. The purpose of that is to reduce healthcare associated infections and to support infection prevention and control. So we produce lots of epidemiological evidence. We also support boards with epidemiology as well. So if there are outbreaks, we would then support boards with some of the epidemiological work that needs to happen there. And we're responsible for the National Mandatory Surveillance Programme as well. So that all sits within the clinical programme. The data and intelligence team is...
So just before we go a bit further, the National Mandatory Reporting Programme.
Yeah.
Now, I may have got the numbers slightly wrong, but there was a point when that was 4 particular microorganisms.
It is currently 3.
3. And what are the 3 that are currently in the...
So Staphylococcus aureus bacteremia, we have E. coli bacteremia and C. difficile infection. I should mention actually that surgical site infection surveillance was part of that programme, but that was paused during the pandemic to support the pandemic response. The programme at the moment is under review.
Before we go into that, just one thing. You're a fast talker.
Sorry.
And speaking as a fast talker, I'm conscious that His Lordship has to take notes, and there's someone doing a transcript out there. And so if you can just slow it down a little bit, then it will make everyone be able to understand more. So you were telling me about it being under review.
Yes, so we're undertaking a national review of surveillance at the moment. That's a request from Scottish Government as part of their healthcare associated infection strategy. So we are revisiting what's included in the National Mandatory Surveillance Programme to make sure that the surveillance that we have in place is focused in the right areas. So we're prioritising what we want to look at. So that's under review at the moment, and surgical site infection is part of that review to determine what we need to do in terms of re-implementing that, if that's where we want to put the surveillance resource.
Okay, now you mentioned before I pulled you off to the 3 microorganisms being nationally reported. You're about to turn to the data and intelligence team, what they did. So what do they do?
So the data and intelligence team are a team of epidemiologists, healthcare scientists and data managers. So they are the engine really for producing the evidence. They undertake the analysis, so they support both the Healthcare Associated Infection Surveillance and Epidemiology Programme, but they also support an AMR, antimicrobial resistance and use programme as well. So they're the service that provides the data and intelligence.
So when we've been asking, say, Miss Imrie or Ms Rankin about reports they were involved in producing, whilst they might well have been involved in defining the scope and understanding the outcomes, the actual engine of the calculations is run by that team.
It is, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, you produced 3 reports for this inquiry at our request, for which we're grateful. I think it's important that we just identify them formally. So the first one, if we just have the front page, is Bundle 44, Volume 2, Document 45, page 685. And this is a report by you produced at the request of the inquiry, commenting on the HAD report. And are you willing to adopt that as part of your evidence?
Yes.
Yes. The next one, there was a supplementary report on aspergillus calculations, and that's it's in bundle 44, volume 3, document 5 at page 222. That might have been the right volume. Yes, page 222. Yes. And so this was produced by you on the 20th of June, 25. And you're willing to adopt that as part of your evidence?
Yes.
We'll come back to it, don't worry. And then finally, you produced a response to a series of questions we asked you to calculate, which is bundle 44, volume 8, document 1, page 3. And this was a result of a request actually drafted by me for particular bits of information on the 1st of August. Now, I appreciate that that request was made by us, and I will ask you about interpretation, because obviously we didn't ask you interpretation questions in it. Are you willing to adopt the calculations as part of your evidence?
Yes.
Thank you. What I want to do is just, I think we've already almost answered this, but we're going to go back to a particular document. Last year, we looked at the October 2019 review of infection rates in pediatric oncology, which is bundle 7, document 6, page 214. Now, this is the draft version, and we took most of the evidence about what happened in it from Miss Imrie in the Glasgow 3 hearing. What involvement did you and your team have in producing this?
So the data and intelligence team produced the report. At that time, Laura Imrie was the clinical lead for the programme that I am now the clinical lead for. I was on the periphery of this report. I was involved towards the end because of the very short turnaround to produce the report. So I wasn't involved all the way through, but I was involved towards the end. I'm now the clinical lead for the programme, and the team that produced the report have advised me all the way through the public inquiry to make sure I'm cited on it.
Because in the closing statement from NSS in the Glasgow 3 hearing, a misunderstanding that I am told I have made, I was corrected on something, and I want to explore it with you to make sure I really understand it properly. It relates to the average line on these charts. If we could go to page 229, and in fact I'll go to 230, and look at the top half of the page, figure 6. So I'm not going to ask you to interpret this, but this is a chart, seemingly a SPC chart, using the environmental, including enteric case group definition from HBS data from July 13, September 18. Now, the light blue line that appears towards the bottom of the chart, just above 2 on the label on the left-hand side, is described as average, I think, on the right-hand side. Is that how I should read it?
Yes.
Now, I want to make sure I really understand how that average line is calculated. Is it, as I thought when we finished the hearing, calculated as an average of all the data points on that chart? Or is it, as I am told by NSS's counsel, calculated by an average, if I've understood her correctly, of the average of everything, as it were, before the move to the new hospital?
That's correct. The average of the rate in York Hill before the move.
Right. So I'm not going to ask you what the meaning of breaching an upper warning limit is, because I had that from Miss Imrie, but just to put it into context, that upper warning limit line is driven to some degree by that average. Have I understood that correctly?
That's correct.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. That's helpful.
Can I just make sure that I've got this, because I was looking at something else. The upper warning, right, maybe 2 steps. The line, which is an average, is that the count? The sort of...
It's the rate per 1,000 bed days.
Sorry, can you just give me that again?
The rate per 1,000 bed days.
So it is at
blue
around
line.
about 2.6 or something on that chart.
Yeah. So the blue line is the average rate per 1,000 bed days in York Hill before the move.
Right. And that's parallel with the x-axis.
Yes.
Right. And the upper warning limit is the orange line.
That's correct.
Right. Sorry, Mr. McIntosh, I was just a
And
little
just for
bit behind you.
completeness, what, as it were, mathematically drives the upper warning limit in any particular point?
Yeah, the upper warning limit is 2 standard deviations from the mean, and that will vary because the bed days vary.
Right. So if the bed days were consistent, the upper warning limit would be a straight line.
That's
But
correct.
because they vary slightly, the upper warning limit varies slightly.
Yes.
Right.
Right. Just take that again. The upper warning line is 2 deviation points.
Yeah.
From 2 standard deviation points.
Yes.
And then the sorry,
from the average.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, from the York Hill average.
And the reason why it varies is reflecting bed days.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
It may be that I ask these rather pedestrian questions, but I'm quite keen to get the exact answer.
Now, it's worth, just for completeness, what is the method of calculating the upper, is it the upper clearance limit or the
upper control limit?
Control limit.
That's 3 standard deviations from the mean.
Now, I'm going to come back as we go through all these documents I'm going to put to you this morning about different methods of understanding statistical significance. But I wonder if you can explain to us why measuring 2 or indeed 3 standard deviations is a useful thing to do.
So whenever you measure anything, any data, there is inherent variation, random variation in anything that you measure. The standard deviations, the upper warning and the upper control limit allow you to consider your data alongside that variation. So if you have a point, for example, outside of a control limit or a warning limit, that is outside what you would expect whilst accounting for random variation. So it allows you, when your numbers are small, to be able to take, because when your data is a small data set, you have more random variation built into that. So the control limits and the warning limits allow you to account for random variation in that. So if you have a point that's outside of the line, then you're seeing something different. It's for example, a higher rate than you would expect based on random variation.
And is that derived from a statistical principle, or is it a question of policy?
It's a statistical principle.
Right, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, now we're going to come to other methods of measuring statistical significance as we go. And what I will ask you as we go is to discuss the differences and the merits of each one, because unhelpfully people have picked different tools to measure this. But what, if anything, now I've asked Ms. Emery this question already, so I'll move on. I'd like to discuss, before we move on to the substance of this, and I'd take that off the screen, please. What sort of knowledge do you feel you have about issues around where the patients were placed in the Queen Elizabeth and Children's Hospital in 15 to 20, how the water system was or indeed wasn't managed, what the reaction was to the water incident? How much context do you feel you have, in case I'm going to ask you questions that require context?
Yeah, I have context. I'm aware of the various controls that were put in place. I might not be able to rhyme off all of the dates, but I think it's important to acknowledge that the HPS reports were written for the IMTs. So all of the epidemiology within the HPS reports were considered in the context of the controls and the changes over time. It wasn't looked at in isolation.
Thank you. Now, I'd like to discuss a sort of slightly odd topic that it's been, I think, been confusing me, is there have been a number of different studies done, and these include, at the time, Ms. Harvey Wood and Dr. Peters, Dr. Kennedy in 18 and 19, at least, I think, 3 different HPS exercises in 18 and 19. Then comes Mr. Mukherjee, and now we have the HAD team and Dr. Drumright. And I think a lot of the questions that I've been asked to ask all these people along the way involve a discussion of the detailed merits and demerits of individual decisions they took in choosing case definitions, choosing denominators, choosing numerators, deduplicating. And at one level, it's quite hard to know where to react. And I suppose it occurs to me there might be 2 ways to react to all this information. It might be that some of these criticisms are so fundamental as to render a particular piece of work entirely useless to us. But some of the criticisms might be such as to just make us need to think about it a bit more, or check it against something else, or take account of a particular weakness. Now, in that context, we'll come to the HAD report in detail in a moment, but just looking back, when you look at Ms. Harvey-Wood and Dr. Peters' work, Dr. Kennedy's work, do you see them as slightly different from the HPS approach, but worth looking at, or something that's got a fundamental flaw?
I don't think there are fundamental flaws. I think they have just done something slightly different to the HPS report.
And we've obviously got NSS's submissions about Mr. Mukherjee's comparator exercise, which I have been heard to say is NSS didn't feel it could be done. He's done it, and you've pointed out the reasons why you probably shouldn't have tried, in essence. What do we do with something like Mr. Mukherjee's exercise, given the flaws that you and your team have identified in it? Do we put it to one side, or do we use it in a particular way? How should we react to this submission from your organisation?
So I think there are elements of the report that have fundamental issues. I think particularly the correlation. I think
so that's the correlation with the water testing results.
I think so. I think there are a lot of limitations around that analysis that perhaps weren't acknowledged.
Again, I'd like to take this particularly slowly. This is the water positivity. Right.
Yes.
So could I just ask you to repeat that? I apologize in advance. I'm going possibly to continue to make these interventions, but it's in an effort really to understand what you were saying. So could I just ask you to repeat what you said about the water positivity?
Yeah, I think there are fundamental issues with that. I think the availability of data.
So is this the number of water tests, effectively?
Yes,
right.
The number of water tests. Certainly early in the exercise there were a very small number of water tests. I appreciate the data sets were particularly challenging to work with. I think the water results, as I understand it, I think the final graph is really helpful. I think that
was the one that was produced at the hearing day.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I'm going to just confirm it, because I don't want to get confused. Can I ask my colleague who has had no warning of this to look at bundle 27, volume 18, I think page 3? Is that the one you mean?
Yes.
Yes. So what's helpful or not helpful about this?
So I think the combined rate for Schiehallion overall per 1,000 admissions, so the pink line.
That's the one towards the bottom of the screen.
Yeah, I mean, I think the 2A and 6A infection rates are quite difficult, and I know that there's been a lot of discussion around whether that was the right thing to do. And I don't think the comparison between
before we go on, so what should we do from your point of view with the pink line by itself?
I think we should use that as
okay. So you were about to move on to something else?
Yeah, so...
Sorry, can you just, can you clarify for me that point?
So this is the overall Schahalian rate line per 1,000 emissions. What are you saying that we do or don't do with that particular information, Ms. Cairns?
The overall Schahalian, I think, is probably a more robust measure of the incidence.
Okay.
Right. And when we're talking about the overall Schahalian rate, that is what, at least on my screen, is purple rather than.
I've been calling it mauve, my lord, but
Well, mauve is entirely acceptable, but it's the line that includes 25.70.
yes, I think Ms. Cairns is nodding.
Yeah,
That's right,
correct.
yeah.
Yeah.
Now you were moving on to something else, and that's why I stopped you. So, are you about to say something else about another part of this chart?
Yeah, I mean, I think the benefit of the overall Schahalian rate is the consistency around that measure. So whilst there may be some challenges around interpretation of the rate numbers, I think it's more about the trend. And similarly with the overall comparator institution rate, we have had questions about how comparable they were.
Yes.
And I think probably comparing the actual rate between the comparator and Schahalian is problematic for that reason.
So again, I'm going to unpack that. So comparing the overall Schahalian rate, the mauve line, with what? What's the one that you've got difficulty?
The orange dashed line, overall
Yeah, so it's the
comparator.
average that you think is the problem. Comparing it with the average, would you compare it with them all separately?
No, I think the absolute rate numbers. So, for example, in 2017, comparing 25.7 with 10.21 is problematic.
Right.
Because I think where we got to with the freedom of information request is that there maybe was some inconsistency around how the institutions had responded. But what I think is important here is looking at the trend over time. So within the comparator institution, there's a fairly stable trend. In the Schahalian unit, we see an increase with a peak in 2017 and then a downward trend.
Could this be you're saying that you're worried about using the numbers, but you're interested in using the shapes?
Yes.
Right. Whilst we're talking about this chart, we'll take the chart off the table because this is a more philosophical question off the screen. I don't think I really appreciated the task in understanding these big databases. It wasn't until, and this is not intended as a particular dig at Dr. Drumright, it wasn't until she explained in her answer a stage she hadn't done when she produced one of our tables that it occurred to me that actually there's quite a process to understand a big database. Now you're nodding. There's a nice transcriber who can't hear that. What is the process that you do within RHI faced with a 200,000 row spreadsheet of bloodstream infection results? So what would you do in order to get the output that might produce, as it were, a nice chart?
So we have a team of really skilled data managers, and that's their bread and butter. So they would have, for example, we use ECOS. They have access to the ECOS.
They use
the ECOS national database of. So that would be where we would get the data about.
And that's
blood
coming
cultures.
in from laboratories around Scotland.
Yeah, that's right. So it's a national database, and they have feeds in from the diagnostic laboratories and reference laboratories. So that all sits within a database in Public Health Scotland. We have access to that database, so our data managers are able to go in and get an extract of the data for whatever piece of work that we are working on. They would bring that into whatever data management or statistical package they're using. They would write code, and we have standard code now for bloodstream infections because we use the same 14-day case definition. And they would run that so that the system would automatically identify the bloodstream infections that need to be included in the analysis.
So it sounds a truism. The code you write, to some degree, defines the output you get.
Exactly.
And if another person or unit wrote code to identify cases and deduplicate, or the other way around, one would hope they would produce the same answer, but they might produce a different answer.
If you had two people working on the same data set with the same case definitions, the same 14-day
Yeah.
definition, they should come up with the same answer.
Yes. If they, would the way that the data is coded in the database, if it wasn't something they were familiar with, would that cause them any problems? Because I noticed that in the data sets, which I now looked at, there's a column L, I think, where multiple positive results are listed in the same field. So you get a 4-digit, 5-digit code for a particular microorganism, and then a comma, and then another one, and then another one, another one. Does that process does that ever cause any difficulty to your team in extracting data from in there to make sure you've counted the right ones?
That is not how the data comes through from ECOS. If that were the data that the team were working with, they would very easily be able to separate those into individual species level data to be able to do the.
But they would have to know how it came.
Yeah, they would have to know how it came, but that's the first step with data management, is you look at your data and you work through what you need to do. You plan what you're going to do with it. You can write your code in advance. You would write a plan of analysis, and your first step within that is data management, and you would understand the underlying data.
Now, I can't put the data sets into a bundle because the first column is everyone's Chi number. But if I'm right that this column lists multiple organisms in the same field, are you saying that that's not how RHI receives it? You get it in a different way? We
get one row per organism, but you can very easily take that row from what we've seen from the data that's been submitted as part of this. You can very easily separate those, for example, 3 organisms in one row into 3 rows, and that would be how we would manage it if that were the data that we had received.
Can you think of a reason why the data provided to Dr. Drumright and the data provided to Mr. Mukherjee by NHS Greater Glasgow was provided in a polymicrobial way with multiple codes in the single row, as opposed to the way you get it?
I'm not sure how the data come into ECOS from the laboratories. There's a big team within Public Health Scotland, an IT team, that maintain the ECOS database. They may well get the data in that format, but they would do the work in the background.
Okay.
Can I, this is me being slow. What you're asking Ms. Cairns to consider is a method of presenting raw data of infections in the form of a spreadsheet.
Yes.
And you're asking her to consider a spreadsheet which has one row representing presumably
one
episode.
One blood test.
One blood test, I beg your pardon. And in the event of that one blood test revealing, let us say, 3 infections, so it's polymicrobial, or 3 organisms, that is presented as a spreadsheet with one row, but 3 separate infection codes.
All in one field in the spreadsheet.
All in one field. And when you talk about a field, and I apologize for my slowness on this, you're talking about a cell.
A cell in Excel, yes.
One cell in a spreadsheet. And Ms. Cairns is saying, well, that is not the way it comes from ECOS.
But it might be the way it comes to ECOS.
It might be.
Yes, right. Again, apologies to everyone for being pedestrian, but if I'm not pedestrian, I don't necessarily follow it.
You mentioned that RHI now has a standard code. When did you bring that in?
Yeah. I think we've probably always had it because we've always done the same thing. But when we're doing analysis now, we are better at sharing code between different projects. Anything that's a bacteremia or bloodstream infection analysis, we use that code.
Because
it's a line of code, I suppose, rather than an actual package of code.
So this question is one you haven't had notice of. And if you want to look at me blankly and go, I can't possibly answer it, you're more than entitled to go away and think about it and send us in a note. I have a recollection, which might well be wrong, but I'm sitting here now, that some of the charts between the three different HPS infections had slightly different shapes of their lines for the same notional groups of bugs. Is that something that rings a bell with you?
I suppose one of the things, and I can't quite remember for the reports that are not the Hemato-Oncology October 2019 report. So that report has in it groups of organisms.
It does.
So the report is the measures within the graphs are not species level. They're groups of organisms. So they have been deduplicated at group level so that we were, for example, the environmental organism SPC chart, we had one environmental organism within the 14-day period rather than multiple. And the reason that we did that was because there were patients with polymicrobial episodes. So we used a grouped.
I think we can see that in back to bundle 7. If one goes to page 255, I think we have the definitions there. Is that what you're meaning, the groups?
Yes.
And I think in the earlier report that was done, I think with a role from Miss Rankin in it, we heard about it yesterday from her, we see that on page, same bundle, page 205. And over the pages, those are the groups you're talking about?
Yes. The Hemato-Oncology report had an additional category added.
It does, yes. So the one that's called environmental and enteric, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But that organism list is different actually as well between the situational assessment and the Hemato-Oncology report.
Okay. Well, then I think I'm going to ask you a much broader question. To what extent should this inquiry worry about small differences between the definitions of these groups? Given that CNR's got a different list and Dr. Mumford has a different list and Professor Hawkey has a different list.
This is groups of organisms.
I think internally within the reports, it is not a problem. I think if you were trying to compare the number of infections between the reports, that's total number of infections between the reports, that would be an issue with comparability. The organism lists have evolved and they continue to evolve. And the more data you look at, the more environmental organisms you identify. So the list grows. When you pull an extract of data from ECOS or from another laboratory system, there isn't a nice master list that covers all organisms in the world. You will find ones that don't fit nicely into the categories that we've got listed here, and you have to look at that organism and say it should live in gram-positive, for example, or you might want to consider whether it's an environmental or an organism with a potentially environmental source, in which case you would need to have a look at the literature. I would talk to consultant microbiologist or infection control doctor, and we would say, okay, we think that needs to live in the environmental organism list going forward.
So the question that comes to me is that ultimately I've got to make sense of all these different charts. And if we just recap, Dr. Kennedy gave evidence that the original list he had, I won't take you to it, came from Dr. Inkster, and it was linked to the 2018 case definition for the water incident. And you recollect that?
Yes.
Yeah. And then we've just looked at the a situational awareness list, which is on page 205 of bundle 7. No need to put it on the screen. And we've just looked at the list from the October 2019 report, and they're a wee bit different. The list in the microbiota SBAR is also different as well. And then we've got Dr. Mumford's list from the inquiries report. And although no one produced a chart from it, we've also got the CNR's case definition. You're not nodding your head. And then we finally got Professor Hawkey's list, which underlies environmentally relevant, he calls it. Mm-hmm. Now, yeah. Within the, if we go to page, same bundle 7, if we go back to page, I think it's 219 again. I've got the impression, and I'm sure colleague counsel will correct me in submissions if I've got this wrong, but I got the impression from the evidence of a number of witnesses, including Dr. Mumford, that the environmental, including enteric group, was the group that came closest to her list and the case notes review list. Now, is that something you recollect being evidence, or are you just taking it on trust from me at this point as a statement of what someone else said?
No, I would agree with that. And I think the environmental enteric list is also most aligned with the HAD report as well.
Right. To what extent and what constraints am I under if one wants to compare?
Mr. McIntosh, it's just my failure in noting. We're talking about the how close lists are, and the environmental, including enteric list, comes closest to the
HAD report?
Yes.
And Dr. Mumford?
And Dr. Mumford.
I would need to look at
No, okay, fair enough. I'm not going to push you on it. What about Dr. Kennedy?
Quite different from Dr. Kennedy.
Quite different from Dr. Kennedy. What about CNR?
Yeah, it would be closer to the CNR because that was gram negatives.
So the reason I'm asking that question is at some point I've got to make a submission to his lordship about how to use all these charts. And let's imagine that I hear from sufficient people with expertise that one can see a comparison between some of these groups and the environmental, including enteric group, in the October 2019 paper. How do I compare the charts? Do I look at actual numbers, or I'd look at trends? What's the thing that I think is the point where you look at them and think, oh, these are interestingly different or similar?
It has to be trends.
Right.
The numbers and rates will be different if the organism lists are different. So the trends is the important bit if you want to look across the reports.
Right. And when we say trends, is that, for example, best exhibited by a best fit line, whether linear or smooth, that's significant, or step changes in rates around events that seem important?
I think it's probably important to look at both. I think there's quite a lot of limitations with the modelled lines.
Sorry, give me that again. Limitations
with the modelled lines. So there's, I think, 2 or 3 different types of models that have been created to describe the trends.
We're going to come to those after the coffee break, right? But you were
sorry, we interrupted you.
Yeah. I think both. I think the modelled lines are interesting if you interpret them in the context of the limitations, but I think looking at the data as well, but also looking at all of this in the context of what we know about the clinical situation and the environmental situation. So these graphs are really just one piece of the jigsaw as far as I'm concerned. If you're looking at the graphs, you have to understand the wider context. The HPS reports and graphs went to the IMTs, so they were discussed with the clinicians, they were discussed with the other experts on the IMT. The graphs with the modelled lines are mainly being looked at in isolation, and I think that's challenging with epidemiology.
So you need to have the context, is your effective point.
Absolutely.
Can I just take the opportunity to get a definition that I can understand of modelled lines. My understanding is that it's an attempt, with the assistance of software, to represent trends and in a smoother and more visually accessible way than what would be the alternative. So maybe I need to know what the alternative would be.
So the models that are being created are trying to describe the trend using maths in a way that is taking away some of the sort of dispersion of all of the different rates. It's trying to say that this is the best maths for me to describe what's happening with the data. I don't think that's answered
Right,
that. Sorry,
okay.
your question.
So it's
My lord, might we come back to this when we're looking at the charts?
certainly,
That might be a
certainly,
more
certainly.
efficient use of.
I didn't want to leave the expression modelled.
No, I think we're going to have to discuss it, but it might be easier to do it with the charts in front of us and then discuss them.
Yeah.
I'd like to just talk for a moment about numerators and denominators. You've obviously produced the reports. We've read the reports. I wonder if we can go to bundle 44, volume 2, your report, page 692. Now, you discuss, well, actually, 691 you just started at. So you've given a lot of thought into the choice of numerators and denominators in the HAD report. By way of context, we'll ask some detailed questions. What's your primary concern or concerns about the way that the HAD report have approached the selection of numerators and denominators for adult patients?
So for adult patients, the way that the infections and activity have been identified is based on the consultant and sector. So as I understand it from the raw data that were provided by Glasgow, Dr. Drumwright was provided with inpatient stays, and when you look at underneath that, the infections and so the numerator and the denominator have been extracted based on the consultant of the patient. Now that doesn't account for the location of the patient. So we know particularly from the adult data, some of the infections were identified in locations outside of hemato-oncology, both in Queen Elizabeth and in other hospitals as well. So the denominator is not representing hemato-oncology location necessarily.
So there's a particular issue that I think you set up in paragraph 3.253, which is on page 694. Top of that page, 694. You at 3.2.5.2, you point out in this paper, a lot of the results have a location of general outpatients, Queen Elizabeth. And then you express a concern in 3.253. Was this an issue that was then resolved by the HAD in their response, or have I misunderstood?
3.2.5.2 was resolved. I think Dr. Drumwright acknowledged that, so I think that one was resolved.
So when you say, does it mean you're wrong or she realises it's true? Which do you mean by acknowledged?
I can't quite remember if that's the one where she had said that I was mistaken. It could be that one.
Oh, well, her response is in 44, volume 5, page 32. And it's paragraph 2b.4.
Could you give me that volume again, Mr.
44.5, my lord, page 32, paragraph 2b.4. So I think this may be a suggestion from Dr. Drumwright that you were mistaken.
Yes, so Dr. Drumwright confirmed the data set that had the the correct data in it. The problem that I had was there were 2 other data sets listed in her response to
Yeah, she
one
wrote
of
a
the
response. We
documents.
asked her some questions about what data
Yeah.
did she use, and she
Yeah.
responded.
So there were 3 data sets listed there that talked about denominators, and in one of them it had the correct assignment of the BMT patients, and 2 where, as far as I could see it, they weren't correct. But Dr. Drumright confirmed that she had used the data set that was correct.
Can we take that off the screen? Am I right to understand that what she has done and what this conversation has clarified is that they picked the patients based on the identity of the consultant, which sector they were in, and they picked the occupied bed days for the identity of the consultant and which sector they were in.
Yes.
So the 2 match.
This particular issue was that some of the bed days in 2016 and 17 had been assigned to Queen Elizabeth when those patients, the BMT patients, were not in Queen
Right.
Elizabeth. It was a very specific issue.
So that's been resolved.
That has been resolved.
But are you still got a concern that by picking consultant and sector, you will have patients having infections when they're not actually in the haematology ward?
Correct.
Correct, right.
And similar with the activity. Some of the activity will be bed days that are outside of hemato-oncology.
Right. Does this have echoes of the difficulties that Mr. Mukherjee was having, identifying where the pediatric patients were in his exercise? If I recollect, he had patients who he didn't realize that the clinical decision unit had been used for a short period, and he had patients who should have been in 2A but were elsewhere in the building. Is this the same sort of territory of confusion, or are we talking about something else?
It probably is. I think the challenge has been for both Dr. Drumright and Mr. Mukherjee is that the information that they have, and I think Dr. Drumright talked about she had been advised that ward level data wasn't robust. So I'm not entirely sure because I haven't seen Mr. Mukherjee's data that he used, but if he had the same data set, he may have the same issue. So the data set from Glasgow that Dr. Drumright used had a row in it for every inpatient stay. And within that, it had the admission ward and the discharge ward.
I mean, a column rather.
Yeah, a column for admission ward and discharge ward, and also the length of stay for the entire stay. So that was where I had noticed that some of the admission wards were not in hemato-oncology and some of the discharge wards were not.
I think I can suggest to you what happened with Mr. Mukherjee's, and I'll work out a way of getting him to explain that in evidence. He had a bloodstream results database of 215,000 rows, but that contained no admissions information. He had an entirely separate document provided by the health board which reported the number of admissions and occupied bed days in each ward. And so what he attempted to do is to match bloodstream infections in effectively 2A with the bed day and admission data he was being given for 2A.
Yeah.
And that's a rather different approach than what Drumright's done.
Yes, very different.
Yeah. And I suspect, and it ended up having its own problems, but maybe we won't go into those now. But staying with Dr. Drumright, to what extent does this issue about the matching of activity and infections, which seemingly also applies to some extent in the pediatrics, how does that impact, to go back to our original question, the value of the exercise that Dr. Drumright's carried out?
So I think she's actually measuring something different. So based on the information that she provided subsequently, I think it was confirmed that the denominator and numerator were both based on consultant. So what is actually being measured here is the incidence of infection for hemato-oncology patients with a hemato-oncology consultant.
Not patients in a particular ward.
Exactly, yeah.
Now, does that come, going back to the category I sort of imposed on you of things that are problematic you probably shouldn't use, or things that you should use with acknowledgement of what their weaknesses are, where does this put her work for adults?
I don't think it's hugely problematic as long as we understand the impact of undertaking the analysis that way. I wasn't able to determine from the raw data how much of that activity and how many of those infections were outside of hemato-oncology locations. I think the problem with the analysis is if the hypothesis is about the location, you're not actually describing the infection rates in the location.
In respect to the adult patients, what do you think the hypothesis was in HAD?
I think they were trying to look to see whether there was an association between the bloodstream infections and contaminated water system.
Would it matter to the usefulness of they had North Sector, South Sector, and BMT, and North Sector was clearly never in the hospital, so I would imagine it's a control of some sort. So I'll ask Professor Hawkey about that. And you're nodding.
Yeah.
And South Sector was in the hospital, so again, that's not my question about that. The question about BMT. Would it matter that, as far as the inquiry understands, apart from those 5 weeks in the summer of 2015, the BMT patient, adults, didn't go into the hospital until after the filters were on the taps? Would that affect the value of that hypothesis, the test? Because they weren't exposed to the water system in the same way.
Yeah, I think that is problematic because so their time in the hospital was after it was 2 months, I think, June and July 2015 when they were in Queen Elizabeth, and then after they moved back was after the environmental controls had been put in place. So yeah, I don't think the BMT patients are going to be a good way to look at whether there's some sort of association between water and infection rates.
But the South Sector patients were exposed to the water system from the move-in.
Yes.
Yes, right. This is probably a good point to stop, Lord, because I was for a coffee break, because I'm going to move on to be. Is it a bit early, or?
If the clock is correct, it's quite an early.
No, I'll go on for another 15 minutes. I've just got a big chunk. We'll do the big chunk and then we'll stop. But I'm just sort of
right. I mean, I'm in your hands,
no, let's
Mr.
move on.
McIntosh, but
let's move on to paediatric data.
We can do just on the BMT point. Try to maybe just summarize to make sure that I've understood it. As we understand things, the adult BMT patients were in the Queen Elizabeth for about, as Mr. McIntosh has said, about 5 weeks in June and July of 2015. They then went back to the Beatson and were not exposed to whatever the conditions in the Queen Elizabeth were. They came back to the Queen Elizabeth in June 2018, after which GDC had taken certain measures to change the conditions. So they were never, other than the 5 weeks, they were never exposed to the unchanged conditions. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you want to look at the association between an exposure and infection rate, you can't only look at an exposed time period.
Yeah.
So the South Sector have the potential to be a useful comparator because they have before 15 in the Beatson and after 15 in the hospital.
Yeah, potentially. Yeah.
And would you be effectively looking? Would you look at the whole period they were in the new hospital?
Mr. McIntosh, can I look for help when you use the expression South Sector because that's the HAD?
I mean 4C, my lord.
Ward C. Yeah.
So when I say South Sector, I mean adult haematology, not in the BMT, were in 4C, but at the very beginning there was talk of them being in 4B, but they are a 4C group.
Yeah.
Yes.
And for the purposes of just connecting our memory, it's our principal witness amongst the consultants is Dr. Hart, who's given written statements. Now, those patients were exposed to whatever was going on in the water from the move. So there has a comparison with the period before the move. Is that something that you...
Yes.
Now, this is the first point I get to ask you about comparisons just between two hospitals. Is it legitimate to compare the rate of infections that the 4C patients in South Sector BMT, not hematology, who were exposed in the new hospital with their experience in a different hospital with a different water system? Is that a legitimate comparison to take?
I think it's difficult, and I think it's probably a similar issue to York Hill and RHC. So you're comparing an older estate with a new state-of-the-art facility. So you're immediately, I think there are some challenges with that. There's other problems along the way as well in terms of is the patient population comparable over time too?
So if you assume that it is,
Yeah.
on the basis no one told it isn't, but no one checked either, and you have a different water system, you've still got the comparison issue between the two hospitals you just mentioned. Now, when Mr. Mukherjee tried this with the English comparators, he was criticised on the basis that they were all different. So that Cardiff and the Vale, Oxford were small, Great Ormond Street had a different age profile, and only Leeds was comparable. I think this was Professor Stevens' evidence. Does that same issue apply here or not?
Not as much, because the patient population is, as you say, is more likely to be similar
Right.
between before and after. At the simplest level, if you're interested in a potential contamination in the water system in one hospital versus the other, then you can make that comparison, but there are limitations around that as well that you would need to understand. And again, it's about the clinical context and the environmental context as well, and that information being interpreted together.
What about using the hospital, the Queen Elizabeth, at its own control? So rather than worrying about what happened before the move, you simply compare the rates before the water interventions with the rates after the water interventions and see if there was a difference. Would that have any merits or demerits?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's you're effectively doing a before and after study. There's an interventions put in place. That's something that we frequently do with epidemiology.
Now,
Yes, can I just essentially ask you to confirm that comparing events, outputs before an intervention and after an intervention is a classical question for epidemiology.
Yeah.
Yep.
now, if we move to pediatrics, there are two issues I want to pick up with you, one of which is the actual occupied bed day data that was used. But before we get to that, which you've raised in your, after we ask you some questions in your final third report, but just staying at sort of the higher level, what are your concerns, if any, about the choice of numerator and denominator in the pediatric part of the HAD report?
Similar issue.
To the adults?
To the adults, yeah. I had a question, and Dr. Drumright confirmed that actually a consultant had been used for both the denominator and the numerator. So that concern that had been in my report had been resolved. So she confirmed that both.
This is for the pediatrics?
For the pediatrics, yeah. It's a similar issue. There were infections that were in other locations, not in hemato-oncology, and also some of the activity was for other locations as well. So again, it's not describing the infection rate in the hemato-oncology location. It's describing the infection rate in patients with a hemato-oncology consultant.
Now, if we go to the HAD report and we go to Bundle 44, Volume 1, and I use a sort of visual aid of looking at a table just to illustrate the question I'm asking, and we go to page 97, we see this table which appears in the report, which lists all the infections that subject to that caveat with Dr. Drumright. We discussed about the actual data she used in deduplication. Do we see here that, for example, if on the wards column, there are some locations that are not in York Hill, Schiehallion ward? And for the Queen Elizabeth, there are some locations that are not in wards 2A or 6A or 4B, depending on time.
Yes.
Now, I've not counted them, but I get the impression it's not a high proportion. So my question is, does this problem matter?
I think it would need to be quantified. I don't know from that it does look slightly different from the raw data. I have to say there were more. I haven't scanned through that recently, but there seem to be more infections outside of hemato-oncology than even just looking at that one table. So I think it would be important to understand the impact of that. What I did notice is that unlike the adults, all of the bed days and infections were in either York Hill or RHC. There weren't hospitals outside of those hospitals that had bed days or infections. So it's less of an issue with the children than the adults, where adults, there were hospitals outside of, so for example, the Royal Alexandra Hospital had infections or activity as well. So it's not such an issue with the paediatrics, but it is still not describing the location.
I mean, because one of the things that occurred to me is that this inquiry has become used to the idea of where patients were placed in the new hospital, because not only have we heard evidence about the decant, we've also heard evidence from individual patients about being moved to different wards at various points. And eventually we got the admission day data and occupied bed day data broken down by wards, so we could see that there were relatively significant numbers of paediatric patients in different wards. Do you have any knowledge about where patients were placed at York Hill?
No.
But if we look at the denominator data, take it off the screen. I need to explain why I asked you a question, because I asked you the question and you might think it's a legitimate question to ask, so I want to give you the opportunity to say so. Can we look, please, at bundle 7, document 7, which is the October 2019 report. And we go to, document 6 rather, and we go to page 226. Now, this appears to be, is this a graphical graphical description of the occupied bed day data used by the HPS team who wrote this report?
Yes.
Yes. So did we ask you to extract the actual data, the numbers that underlies this?
Yes.
Yeah. And you, I think, addressed that in your third document, which is at bundle 44, volume 8, document 1, page 3. And if we go to page, I think it's page 20. I really hope I've got this bit right. No, I'm entirely the wrong place. Let me just find it. We go to page 14.
Sorry, could you give me the volume again?
Are we in volume 8?
Thank you.
Let's go to volume 6. I think it might work better. So, bundle 44, volume 6, document 1, page 3. Page 4? Yes. No. Page 14. Well, after that confusion of numbers, my lord, what we have is bundle 44, volume 6, page 14.
Thank you.
And so this paper you wrote in response to our questions. In fact, you helpfully put our questions into the document. And then at the end, and if you go to page 18, you plotted a chart which we see might have a relationship to those previous charts that we just looked at.
Yes.
This is the two added together.
That's the combined.
Yeah. And then you then created a table on page 24. Can you explain the table, and if you consider it matters, what's going on and why it matters?
Yep, so this is the bed days that we have from the HAD report. We've got the bed days for haematology and oncology from HPS, and then the combined. So haematology and oncology are from the original graph, and then the combined is from the new graph. And then I have, or the team have, worked out the difference between the bed days used by Dr. Drumright and the HPS bed days. And there are some quite large differences. There are some small differences, but also some large differences as well. And I think that reflects the different sources of the data.
Well, but why would there be a different source? So what's the source of the data that you used in the October 2019 report?
So we use it's called an ISDS1 dataset. It's another national activity dataset used by, held by Public Health Scotland. Those data are submitted by health boards at specialty level, not at ward level. So specialty, so hemato-oncology specialty. As far as I understand it, the bed days used by Dr. Drumright were from Glasgow's track care system. I don't know why the bed days that we use were not provided to Dr. Drumright. The data that goes into ISD1 is also held by NHS GDC. So when I looked at the data that Dr. Kennedy had used, it looks like it's the same. It looks like it's the same data that we used, and he said it had come from his acute services information systems. I think a team had provided it. So he looked like he was using the same bed days as us. When we did the comparison between the bed days being used by Glasgow alongside the HPS bed days in the October report.
So that's if we go back to bundle 7, page 226, we can see there's little differences in the orange where there's slight differences.
Yeah. An ISDS1's a live database, so it might be that there's, differences that happen. So that I think the differences between what Glasgow were using back for the IMT for Dr. Kennedy is almost identical to what we were using. But Dr. Drumright's are quite different. And some of those bed days will be from other specialties, like we've talked about in the denominator, because the activity had been extracted based on the consultant rather than location, whereas the ISDS1 is based on location. So that explains why there might be more bed days in Dr. Drumright's, but it doesn't explain why there might be less.
Right. I don't think I got all the steps there.
So just to recap, if we go back to volume 8, bundle 44, this table has, after the years and the month, it has a column from the HID bed day database, which you've had access to, and in fact it's in one of the bundles.
Yes.
Yes, so that's the number of bed days that Dr. Drumright worked with. The bits in blue are the data that was supplied to the HPS team for the October 2019 report.
Yes.
And that comes from a national source that Glasgow had fed into.
Yes.
And part of that comparison was to compare what Glasgow was feeding in with what you got out. And there's a very small difference.
Not what they were feeding in, but what they were using in their analysis.
Right, just to see whether there's a difference. And it's slight.
Yeah.
And then there is, however, a difference between what you were getting from the national database, which Glasgow had fed into, and what HAD are using.
Yes.
And this is this right-hand column, which has a huge range of different scales of difference.
Yes.
Now, there's two questions about this. One is, does it matter? I'll come to that in a moment. The other is, how might it happen? Can you help us on how might this happen? Other than the idea that picking up consultant activity elsewhere in the hospital?
I don't have an answer for that,
Right.
other than for perhaps the additional bed days are from other locations outside of hemato-oncology, but I can't explain the other differences.
Right. But in terms of, does it matter? Why might it matter if it matters at all?
I mean, what Dr. Drumright has used is perhaps consistent, but there's quite a lot of variation in the differences as well. So that would concern me a bit more in terms of whether there is a consistency around these bed days.
Because if we go back to bundle 7, page 226, I get the impression, and tell me whether I'm wrong, that in oncology there's a broadly flattish sort of rate, and in hematology it's broadly flattish until some point in 17 it goes up. Is that sort of roughly what you should see there? Or am I being too clever and reading stuff that I can't see?
No, I think it's clear that there was an increase in activity in hematology, but that would need clinicians to
tell you the answer.
tell us whether
Right.
there might have been a change in the way that care was being delivered, and they decided to do more inpatient than day case. Because this is only inpatient activity in this graph.
Okay, well, I'm going to ask you a couple more questions about bed days, and then I'm going to ask you an overall question, like I did for the adults, of what we should do with this calculation. So what I'd like to do is to go to the HAD report itself. So that's bundle 44, volume 1, and to, I think it's figure 5, which is on, in fact, no, not figure 5, it's table 4 on page 71. Now, do you see how there are some months, which there's 1 month there in 23, which is red?
Yes.
And over the page, for South Sector, there's lots of months that have some numbers that are red.
Yes.
And then over on page 73, in a discussion about bacterium adult patients in the final paragraph, that there's noticing some spikes in a chart. And this is, the chart itself is over the page, but it says at the bottom, when we adjust for unrealistically small denominators over the page, predominantly from South Sector, which moved to Queen Elizabeth in May 15, figure 6, we see a dampening effect in the spikes. Now, what view do you have about the legitimacy of deciding to average out the unrealistically small denominators for a certain month?
I don't think it's unreasonable to do, but I think you would need to have a bit more background about whether that was the true activity or whether there was an artifact or problem in the data. The other point with this is I think there were months where there seemed to be an unreasonably high denominator, but that was not adjusted. So I think the only denominators that were adjusted here were the ones that were low and were increasing the rate. But again, I think it's a difficult situation when you have just the data and you don't have the opportunity to say to clinicians or the bed days experts, is there a reason for this?
Which organisation would have access to that information?
NHS GGC.
Right. The next thing I want to look at is in Dr. Drumright's response on volume 5. And it's on page 32. So it's paragraph 2b.5. Now, have you read this paragraph before about the 2005-2007 data?
Yes.
So what is it that Dr. Drumright's describing she did? Or they did, it's all three of them.
So at very high level, there were no bed days for 2005 to 2007.
This is for the paediatric patients?
Yes. Yeah. And Dr. Drumright has made an assumption about that and has calculated bed days based on other data.
That's the
In
rest
order-
of the period at the hospital.
I think it was 2008 to 2014. So yeah.
Yeah. Do you have any any views on whether that's an appropriate approach to take?
I think it's quite a big assumption. And I also question whether it was necessary to do, whether 2008 to 2014 would have been enough data without having to add some additional years data in to the analysis. 2008 to 2014 is quite a wide range. So 2014's 9 years from the beginning of the estimated bed days, 2005. A lot can change, I'm sure, in the way that care is delivered in hemato-oncology in that time period. Again, it's probably conversations around whether that's appropriate with clinicians to understand whether that is an acceptable way to do it.
Is there any particular reason to do it, though?
I assume the reason to do it was to increase the amount of data and the longer time period.
I mean, I don't know whether there was less or more activity in that period. And it seems quite clear from the consequential witness statements, and I think Professor Gibson and Dr. Rankin, that people don't remember very much about that back then. And there are no minutes of the Acute Infection Control Committee before 2009. If in doing that, your assumption was wrong, would that have the effect of sort of skewing one end of the trend, either up or down?
Yes.
So when the inquiry looks at the trend in York Hill, and I recognise trend is a very soft word, and we'll come back to what it means after the coffee break, would we be advised to look at the whole period or to limit ourselves to 8 to 14 to 15?
I think 2008 to 2014 is probably the most appropriate to look at, but I don't know if there was a trend line for 2008 to 2014.
I think there is in the latest material.
Okay.
But
okay. Yeah.
I'm just going to double check, Lord. I think this might be a better place to stop.
Right. Well, as I said, Ms. Cairns, we usually take a coffee break. So can I ask you to be back for 11:45?
Thank you.
Ms. McIntosh.
Thank you, Lord. Now, what I'd like to do now, Ms. Cairns, is to talk about what you might call general and analytical and statistical methods by reference to the charts. Now, you've actually given a page and a half of discussion, which is in your first report, so that's volume 2, page 695, and over the page. I'm not going to go through it in the order in your report, because we can read that. What I'd like to do is discuss it by reference to the charts that you refer to there and the ones that come along. So let's go to the HAD report itself, figure 22, which is bundle 44, volume 1, document 1, page 118. So what do you understand this chart, figure 22, if we could zoom into the top half of the page, please, to be in the HAD report?
So this is the infection rate over time per 1,000 bed days from 2005 to 2022. The data has been segmented at the time of move. So we've got the red.
And this is for paediatric hemato-oncology
This
patients?
is paediatric, yeah. So the red line is for York Hill and the blue line is for RHC Queen Elizabeth.
Now, in your paper, I think at 3.36 paragraph, you discuss some questions or concerns you have about this chart and its use of statistical methods and trend lines. What's your point?
So the main point for me was for the blue part of the graph. So a straight line has been fitted over that time period, and I think there's too much variation within that time period to have a straight line on there.
Is there a way of measuring whether a straight line is an appropriate fit to a particular set of data?
There is. So I have worked with Professor Kim Kavanagh on some of these interpretations as well, and I had asked her that very question, and she said it's actually slightly more complicated than describing when just to have some numbers that say whether the line fits well or not. There's nothing mathematically wrong with the line, but at the same time, it's not describing the variation over that time period well.
Because I've read in various reports, indeed you mention it in your report, concepts of p-values.
Yes.
Is that, are we talking about the same area of study? And if so, is that relevant in this context?
So the p-value tells you whether that line is a significant trend down.
Right.
As far as I remember, I don't know for this graph, but there were some of the graphs where Dr. Drumright talked about a decrease or a significant...
So there is on the next page,
yeah,
the top of the page, second bullet point, a discussion of a twofold decrease across the whole period, but there's no discussion of p-values in HAD report against its figures.
it's best practice to include p-values.
Right. So what...
Have you used the have you used the expression p-value?
P-value, yes. I was about to ask, Ms. Cairns, you're going to have to explain what is a p-value and why is it useful and when does it tell you something?
So it comes back to this issue of random variation whenever you measure data. So the p-value gives you a measure of whether things are different whilst accounting for that variation. So if you have a p-value of less than 0.05, then you would say something was significantly different. And that takes into account that variation around an estimate.
So if you had a truly random result and you tried to fit a trend line to it, it would have a p-value well out of that range.
The p-value is for the slope of the trend.
Right.
You can fit a line to any data, really. Yeah. There are ways to measure the residuals. Sort of the distance of the points from the line. There is a way to do that, but it's more complicated than that because there are lots of things that affect where those infection rates sit. in the line. So it's not quite as simple as saying the line fits well or doesn't fit well.
So that brings us to the topic of confidence intervals. I want to look at a chart in the HAD response document.
Before we before we leave 22, and it's my fault.
Page 118.
Was your question directed at both trend lines?
Do you have the same issue with the other trend line?
No. Without having any sort of statistical background to it, that line to me doesn't appear to have as much variation as the blue line. There's a period sort of mid 2016 to mid 2019, end of 2019, where it looks to me like there's a period of an increased incidence of infection.
And I can't remember which page you did this, but at some point you made the observation that there are no zero values in a period between 16 and 20.
Yeah.
What's the point you're making there?
So if you look at the red line, there's much more movement around the line, equal movement around the line, I would say. So, and you're seeing zeros there, and you're seeing higher values. So actually that, to me, looks more like random variation.
Right.
You would expect random variation. And actually some of the numbers of infections in each of these data points is quite small. And when the numbers are small, you would expect to see quite a lot of random variation in the infection rates. On the right-hand side, to me, there is a long period where there are always infections. It doesn't have the same random variation up and down pattern. It's a different pattern from York Hill.
Okay, now I'd like to look at a chart that was produced by the HAD authors in their response document, and that's in 44 volume 5, document 2, page 50. Now I think, and I will check with Dr. Drumwright tomorrow, this is broadly the same data as figure 22 we just looked at. Now if we again zoom in the top half of the screen, I'm not going to ask you to, well first let's look at this. What do you understand to be the purpose of the shading on this chart?
So the shading is confidence intervals.
So how does this confidence interval, as far as the report describes it, appear to work? What's it telling you?
It's just it's a range of values, really. So it gives you a range around each point on the line. Again, that sort of gives a bit of accounting for the variation that you see in data.
Is it to some degree saying that the reality at any particular point will be somewhere in that shaded area?
Yes.
And does that have a connection to the concept of statistical value or reliability?
Yeah. So a 95% confidence interval is sort of equivalent to a p-value of less than 0.05.
So in this case, if we take the blue line, for example, the linear line, the person who's produced this graph is effectively saying, if the linear line is right, then at any point in time, the infection rate was inside the blue shaded area. And if the linear plus smooth line is right, at any point in time, the infection rate was inside the pink shaded area.
Yeah, give or take.
Give or take,
It is a range, yeah.
Yeah. Now, this would therefore be the first chart we see that actually has confidence intervals on it. You've looked at this. Does this tell us anything new that we didn't see previously in figure 22?
Yes.
What's that?
It accounts for the variation within the data. So the red line is a better fit for the data.
And how is the red line calculated?
So the generalized additive models include a factor in there that looks at variation in the data rather than trying to fit this straight line. It will look for non-linear dynamics in the data.
So it's hunting for trends.
It's looking, yeah. I think what happens is it moves along each point and then decides whether it needs to change the line or not. Is my understanding.
Is it effectively looking ahead of itself as it goes along?
I'm not sure if it's looking ahead of itself, but I think what it's doing is trying to find the best way to describe the data.
Okay. So this may be an area which you don't want to go to because of your background. So I want you to tell me if it is.
So I'm not a modeler.
Right.
My job is more about interpreting what I see. So I'm not the right person to talk about too much about the methodology.
Let me ask you a question, then you decide whether it's the next page. If we were to zoom in, because I've arranged this with my colleague, to the period between 14 and 18, roughly, this isn't there, we have a dip in the pink shaded area and the red line, which Dr. Drumwright and Professor Hawkey and Dr. Alwell discuss in their commentary. Do you have a view, or do you feel you have a sufficient expertise to have a view on what that dip is reflecting in the real world, in the real data?
I think it's important to think about it in the context of some of the other data that's been presented as well. I mean, we've seen this effect, perhaps not at the same points in time, but we have seen the effect in multiple other reports where the infection rate decreased after the move to RHC, followed by an increase from mid-2016. I think there's quite a few other reports that have shown that. The timelines around this are slightly different. I think Dr. Drumwright talked about the decrease starting quite a bit earlier than some of the other reports have identified. And then I think the increase had started earlier as well. But I think for these models, it's important to acknowledge that they're very simple. All that's been modelled here is infection rate over time. I think we've talked quite a lot about confounding and comparability. So each of these data points is a population, and there will be differences at points in time. You can create more complicated models that includes factors that might be changing the relationship over time. But that's quite complicated, and you need to have a lot more data than Dr. Drumwright had available to her. So the models are simple.
There's a question I want to ask Dr. Drumwright, and she knows I'm going to ask it to her. I haven't got her answer yet. I figured I should do that in the hearing. Is to what extent is the line starting in early 14 speaking about something real that's actually happening in the world, or the line attempting to get down low enough to meet the 0 results which exist in late 15, early 16? Is it a creature of the model, or is it a real thing? Now, can you answer that question?
I think that the models are too simple, that any specific dates are very approximate. Okay. I don't think there's enough. I don't think the model's complicated enough for us to take the dates as the point where rates were increasing and decreasing.
So is this effectively back to where you were with Mr. Mukherjee? It's the shape that matters here.
Yeah, I think it's the shape that matters. I think the smooth line fits the data much better than the linear. And I think that there was a decrease and there was an increase, but I don't think we can put too much on the specific dates of when the increase and decrease happened.
What then happened is that I asked Dr. Drumwright and Mr. Mukherjee to attempt to agree charts for 3 discrete periods. That is 8 to 15 in York Hill, 15 move to the day of the decant in RHC, and then the decant to the move back into Ward 2A. Now, I haven't yet asked them their opinions about whether that was a good idea or what it means. I'm leaving that for the evidence. So I feel I should ask you first, do you have any problem with looking at charts for those periods? Do you think that's a valuable exercise, or is there some flaw in taking that approach of cutting it up into sections?
I don't think there's any flaw in taking in that approach. I think it makes sense to look at the data in that way, because we have a specific clinical understanding of changes that happened in the time period. The one issue with cutting the time periods is that you do reduce the power of the models a little bit.
Because the period gets shorter.
Because it's less data in the model. So yeah, the period is shorter. So that can be an issue. It makes it a little bit more difficult to see a significant result if there is one there.
Now, the other thing I asked, before we get to that, do you have any views about whether the decant day is a good boundary point to look at, or whether there would have been better ones, given your knowledge of what happened in the reaction to the water incident?
I think it's probably quite difficult, but it's not unusual in this type of analysis, because within IPC, nothing ever all happens at the same time. So we know that between, I think, May and September, we had filters, there were drains clean, and then there was a decant. So there was multiple interventions happening at the same time. So I don't think the decant is too problematic, but I think it's probably understanding that immediately prior to that, there were other controls being put in place.
Right. What I want to do then is to look at 3 or 4 charts and some rates, and I'll just explain. Well, let's do the charts first. I'm not going to ask you to give an opinion until anything other than sort of statistics of what you see until the end. So if we look at page 57 of bundle 44, volume 7, this is Dr. Drumwright's work. Now, she hasn't given a commentary on whether she thinks this is either valid or what it means, beyond the p-values she has calculated. So if you go to page 56, you see I asked her a question, and she, at the bottom of the page, calculates a rate for the period at York Hill from 8 to 15 of 4.02 and something per 1,000 bed days. And then over the page on 57, she plots a chart with a single, well, actually there's 2 lines in there, but they're effectively the same shape, of a GAM fit. And then above it, in paragraph 2.3.2, she discusses the p-value for that line. Now, what do you take that she's saying in the paragraph 2.3.2?
So the p-value for the smooth line means that there isn't a non-linear trend within the data.
Right, so it's a linear trend if there's anything.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, the line of the linear line and the smooth line are the same.
But is there a trend in the linear trend?
No.
No, there's no trend at all.
There's no trend.
No trend, okay. If we then go over onto page 58, the question is at the top. The period is June 15 to September 18. The value she's calculated is 4.76 and a bit per 1,000 bed days in that period. And then there's a chart with a linear line, which is blue, and a linear, which is smooth, linear plus smooth, which is red. And then there's discussion above. What do you take from paragraph 2.4.2?
So the linear trend is significantly increasing, but because the smooth p-value is less than 0.05, that means that there is a significant non-linear trend. So we would choose the smooth line over the blue, and what that tells us in terms of the non-linear dynamics is that there was a steeper increase to begin with, but a continuing increase after that.
So it started. We all remember being taught charts back in the pandemic. This is not an exponential growth.
No.
No, this is sort of, in a sense, the opposite. It's a steep increase at the beginning and then a slower increase after that.
Yeah.
Again, just so that I'm following, if one considers the blue line without the commentary, that is my understanding of an exponential curve. Although when you were differentiating it from the red line, you described it, if I followed you correctly, as linear. And if we go to the commentary, because of the p-value, the linear, the blue line, does not have the, you can't have confidence in that, and therefore the red line is preferable.
Yeah, because the red line has a p-value of less than 0.05, it fits the data.
Right.
So that you would choose the smooth line.
Right.
over the blue.
And the smooth line is the red line.
The red line,
Oh,
yeah.
right.
So could you use words to describe? Accepting will interpret what it means, but what is going on? What is the red line, the linear smooth, telling us happened in that period, if this has any validity?
So the red line, there is an increase, a modelled increase, which looks to begin almost immediately after the move, but quite slowly. I would say then by sort of early mid 2016 that line is a steeper increase, and then by 2017 it slows down a bit.
Right.
But what I should say again is that these models are simple.
They are.
Yeah. So I wouldn't take too much with looking at dates as to when things increase and decrease.
Well, what I wanted to show you two more charts and ask you a question about these models. So if we go on to the next page, page 59, the period is now changed June 15 to 2.5. It's from October 18 to February 22. And this is the chart below, figure 2.6. And the rate has been calculated 2.88 per 1,000 bed days. Is this similar to, in a sense, the first chart at York Hill? There's not a trend here.
Yes.
Right. Now, just for completeness, on page 100, Dr. Drumright has calculated a trend. Page 60. I don't know why I said page 100. Page 60 has calculated the period, the whole of the new hospital period from the move to the opening of the new Ward 2A. And she's calculated the rate of 3.97. Does her model have anything that is significant in it?
Yes. So the smooth line, the red line, is telling us that there is a significant non-linear trend,
Which is
to increase and decrease.
And the peak-ish is somewhere in the end of 17, 18.
Yes.
And that's your core point. Don't look at the dates too carefully.
I think it's probably approximate.
Now, before we go and look at Mr. Mukherjee's attempts, can you just summarize for us what areas of value you see in these charts and what areas of concern you have in using them? Obviously, one of the concerns will be don't look at the data too closely, but what are the other concerns you have?
So I think these models are better than the originals. I think these represent the data better. I think there is quite a small amount of data in these models, which affects, first of all, it affects whether you see a trend or not. If you have a small amount of data, it makes it more difficult for something to be identified as significant, because if you're thinking about it from a confidence interval perspective, that will be very wide. And I think, again, the dates they need to be considered approximate.
In terms of what's useful in these charts?
I think it's useful to see the trends interpreted in the context of the limitations. I think it's useful. I think the trend, there was one of the trends that was a significantly increasing trend, even though the power had been reduced by the size of the model. I think it was the period from the move to the
It's page
decant.
58. Is it this one?
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, could I just take that point again? It's looking at the chart on page 58, Ms. Cairns, the point you make is?
So that, despite being cut down and there being less data within the model, which reduces the power of the model, we are still seeing a significant increasing non-linear trend in the data. But there are limitations with that I've talked about, and it is a very simple model.
Now, I want just to show you Mr. Mukherjee's attempt to answer the same questions, which are the same bundle. There was a chart presented on page 47. if we zoom to the top half of the page and ignore the Python code, now he's sought to fit straight trend lines. And on the previous page, he discusses the significance of them. So if we just look at that for a moment to see what we can see, and then step back top half of page 46, he has calculated rates that aren't that dissimilar from Dr. Drumwright's, but he has a different view of significance. He seems to think that both of the two rates trends he's calculated in Children's Hospital are significant, which is not quite the way Dr. Drumwright came out with it. Now, if we go back to page 47, do you have any, as it were, things we find useful in this attempt, figure 2 on page 47, and things that we should be wary about?
So I think one of the differences here is that the change points have been selected by Mr. Mukherjee.
No, the change points have been selected by me. These are the same change points as Dr. Drumwright.
Oh, I see. In terms of, yeah, I'm getting...
He just stuck them all together in one chart.
I'm getting them, the other change point analysis, Dr. Drumwright lets the...
No, that's a different one.
Yeah,
so okay. This is which I'll come back to, but this is Mr. Mukherjee, if I understand correctly, simply putting the three charts together. So what's the positives and negatives in terms of value here?
Yeah, so I suppose the negatives is that this is linear lines, whereas Dr. Drumwright has got the smooth effects included in her model. There might be a benefit in that it depends on how Mr. Mukherjee's done this, but there's a way that you can include all of the data in the model and then segment it, and you don't lose the power in the same way that Dr. Drumwright will have done by having 3 separate models. But I think that might be a question for Mr.
Well,
Mukherjee.
yes. What I might ask you to do is, after today, if you would speak to the NSS legal team, and they will send me a rule 9 question based on what you think would be the good question.
Okay.
So advantages and disadvantages? It's disadvantages, it's straight lines. Advantages are, if any?
I think the advantages are the fact it's been segmented at those points in time where we have an interest.
Okay. What I want to do is go back to that chart you thought that you might be looking at, which was on Dr. Drumwright's, the HAD response document, volume 5 of bundle 44, page 52. Yes, so Dr. Drumwright can explain this in greater detail, and she, of course, give evidence tomorrow. But as I understand it, she has sought to let the maths work out where the change points are in very simple terms. Do you understand what she's trying to do?
Yeah, I think she's let the statistical package decide where things need to change in terms of the model. The rates that have been calculated, again, this is based on an assumption of no trend within those individual segments. So the rates along the top are the average rate across that period without any sort of accounting for whether there's any trends within that.
Again, what value is in this sort of exercise, and what things should we be careful about?
I mean, I think it's helpful. I think it's helpful to see one of, again, I think picking, allowing the stats package to decide doesn't really tell you about the points in time that we're interested in. I think it's interesting that there's an increase in the rate around about the time that the clinicians are telling us that there's been.
So what would that be, late 17, when we move from the green to the blue?
Yeah.
The final thing is that when you did that analysis of the bed day data, you also calculated, at my request, and I want to see whether you think it was useful, you also calculated, this is volume 8 of bundle 44. No, it's not. It's volume 8, document 1, page 3. I've done this again. Sorry, it's not there at all. It's volume 7. volume 6. 44, volume 6, page 14. Yes. So we go to page 20. Now, I asked you to see if you would use the October 2019 report data and create calculations of rates between periods. And I think you actually picked other periods from the ones that we put in the original note. I wonder if you can talk us through this table. But would it be all right to focus on environmental enteric? Would that be a reasonable thing to do, to compare it with Dr. Drumright?
Yeah, I think so.
Right. Could you talk us through that column, which is the second from the right combined column?
So the initial period that we were interested in was all of the time within York Hill, and the rate there was 2.55 per 1,000 bed days.
Should we worry that it's only a year, or not even a year? 2 years, rather, sorry.
No, I don't think so. I think it's actually helpful maybe that it's a shorter period because there'd be less variation within there.
Okay.
And then we have the period from the move until the decant, and we've got a rate of 3.05. And then after that time, we have from the decant until the end of the period, which
So that's
was,
only the year until the September IMTs of 2019.
Yeah, so 2.94 for that one. And then the additional point that I thought would be helpful to include, because the period from the move until the decant, there was quite a lot of variation in the time period, and I thought that was perhaps masked in the 3.05.
So this is the period from the year after the move.
Yeah. So the rate then was 0.91. But I suppose it's just worth recognising that for some of these points there were quite small number of cases. So
yeah. So we've got from HAD data, we've got figure 22. We've got the recalculated F2, F3 chart with the smooth best fit line that has the dip before the move and then the peak in 18. And then we've got the segmented piece of work that I asked Dr. Drumright and Mr. Mukherjee to do. And then using your data, we have this table. Do you have a view about what these two pieces of data are telling us about whether there was, or how would you describe the number of infections in these groups of organisms in York Hill and the Children's Hospital over the whole period of time? What would be your, if you were just summarizing up in a elevator pitch, how would you describe what happened using the data?
yeah, so not just looking at these data, but also looking at some of the other reports that have been produced, where we see the rates in York Hill at a specific point in time, and then a period in the first year after the move where there was a lower infection rate, followed by this period from, I think, sort of mid-2016 to maybe 2019, where there was this period of an increased rate of infection, followed by a decrease after that. And I think some of that is in this table. You can see some of that.
So I'm going to ask you, and how confident are you in that assumption, in that analysis?
I'm confident in that because of consistency across various different reports.
Right. The next question I wanted to ask you about this particular issue of paediatric bloodstream infections is about what they're consistent with. So there are various different ways witnesses have summarized what they think happened, and they relate to different periods in time. And I'm going to ask you whether you see these, or what you might call hypotheses, as consistent or inconsistent with the HAD data. So put aside your chart, so just the HAD data. Now, for example, there was in the HAD report itself, if we go back to page 119, I think, of volume 1. 119, please. the second bullet point. Is the statement in the second bullet point consistent with what we have now analysed through the HAD response document and Dr. Drumwright and Mr. Mukherjee's further analysis of the data?
No.
Why?
Because when you segment this, you see a different picture. I think if you look at the data overall, in fact, though, I think that statement might be based on case numbers with different follow-up periods. So I think that twofold decrease is problematic just by itself as well. But if we look at the segmented analysis, that's not what that data looks like.
There's been a view expressed that there was an excess in infections in what Professor Hawkey has listed as environmentally relevant organisms, or HPS are listed as environmental enteric organisms, in the Children's Hospital from some point in mid-16 until some point in 2019-ish. And that's an exceedance of what you would have expected, and more than exceedance of what you expected. Is that consistent with what you've seen in the data?
An exceedance of infections
Yeah.
during that time period,
Yeah.
yes.
And why do you say that?
From the data, from data we've looked at in the HPS reports, I think that point in the middle of the change point analyses shows that there was something different during that time period.
And then if you recollect, in the late summer of 2019, there was a disagreement amongst those participating in the IMT. Whether rates had returned to what was referred to by some people as normal rates of infections. What do you think, what description? Well, firstly, is that idea that there was a return to normal rates of infection, is that consistent with the data, the HAD data as now analysed?
With the HAD
data?
I think that final segment, the rate was stable rather than decreasing. I think Mr. Mukherjee's final segment had a significant decrease, but not in the HAD.
And if you recollect that Dr. Drumwright calculated a rate for 19 to 22 of 2.8 and 4.8 for the period from the move to the decant, and that wasn't 4.8, it was well, let's go and find it. Bundle 44, volume 7, page 52. Not page 52, page 58. 4.7. And then on the previous page, page 56, a rate of 4.02 at York Hill. Can we compare the rate at York Hill of 4.02 with the rate after the decant of 2.8 and learn anything useful from that comparison?
I think it's probably a bit of a stretch.
Why?
There will be other changes that might impact on infection risk during that time period. Changes in the patient population, changes in treatment, the way care is delivered. It seems it would be unusual, I think, to compare York Hill with a period of time after the move. I think it's also, I think in terms of comparisons, you're comparing one hospital with I'm not sure about that comparison actually.
Can we derive any value from comparing the 4.7 rate in HAD data between move and decant with the 2.8 in the years after decant? Is that of any value to us in understanding what happened?
So from move to decant and after the decant?
Yes.
Yeah, I think so.
Why is that?
Because there's a specific intervention between the two time periods. So you're looking at the infection rate before and after the decant.
Now,
And you could use that, I mean, with a lot of limitations and caveats to look at whether the decant had an impact on infection rate.
now, if we turn to the adult patients in the HAD report, I know you've had some concerns about that as an exercise. Other than those spikes we talked about in the south sector hematology patients, can you see any other pieces of data that suggest that there was any form of exceedance of infections in the adult patients?
I don't think that there's anything from these models or from these data that necessarily say that's the case.
And what about those two spikes that we were looking at before when we were talking about the removal of the low levels of occupied bed days? And that's on bundle 44, volume 1, page. It's figure 6, so it's on page 74. There are more spikes on 74, and then they average out, and there's only one left. What do we do with that information? What do those spikes tell us, if anything?
So I think again, it comes back down to the clinical interpretation. I think if you were using these graphs as part of an incident management, you would immediately be thinking, if I saw these graphs, I'd be thinking, first of all, is there maybe an artifact in the data? That's the first thing you would do looking at this. You would want to understand, is there maybe something going on with the data? Could there be something with the numerator or the denominator? And then after that, I think you would be asking questions around how many infections were in those spikes, and what the situation was at that point in time. It's clinical interpretation again, I think, that would be needed.
And so if we go to page 75, where one spike remains in late 2017, we would need to know how many infections are in that spike and then talk to clinicians in there.
I would want to understand clinically.
And I haven't actually checked, and I will do so. What weight should we give to the views of the clinicians who've already given the statements about their experience? If they say something was happening, would that mean one thing? If they said nothing happened, would that mean another thing?
I think their views and the epidemiology are all part of a jigsaw that need to go together.
What I want to do now briefly is just to talk about the Aspergillus exercise carried out by Dr. Agarwal, I understand. I'm not going to go over the period points you make about G duplication, or the point you make about, well, there's one point I want to take to you. So that's volume 2, page 702. It's at 4.4. Sorry, next page, 4.5. It's the smallness of the cases. You discuss root cause analysis. Are you effectively saying that what this Aspergillus data needs is sort of a mini root cause analysis / case notes review to really understand it?
I would say when the numbers are this small, then that would be helpful. I think one of the differences with Aspergillus as well is that the latency period is long. These analyses are based on the location of where the sample's been taken. And the latency for Aspergillus can be from days to weeks to months even. So we're only describing where the patient is when they have had their sample taken. It doesn't tell you anything about prior exposure.
So they could have been exposed at home?
At home, in another ward,
Yeah.
The root cause analysis is, so the benefit of doing that type of work is that you can really dig into all of these different aspects.
Now, I'm conscious that time is short, and Dr. Drumright and the HAD produced similar charts for Aspergillus the conclusion of which appears to be nothing statistically significant happens over the rate. Mr. Mukherjee has produced a chart in which he asserts that something has happened. And I really welcome your thoughts on it. It's on Bundle 44, Volume 7, page 42, Figure 1. So, if I understand correctly, this is a chart of the infection rates for Aspergillus using monthly data. And of course, most months there's no infections. Firstly, is there any problem with using monthly data when there's no infections in most months?
I think yes, for a linear regression, there is an issue with the zeros. So I discussed this with Professor Kavanagh, and if a negative binomial regression had been undertaken, then it wouldn't have been such an issue. But I think with a linear regression, that can be problematic with all of the zeros.
Okay. Because if I understand it, Mr. Mukherjee is suggesting that the confidence intervals don't really overlap, and therefore that this might be a significant change in infections. What do you have in terms of whether we think that's something we should rely on, or we think that's something that's problematic?
I think we would need to see more data on that, because I think that the confidence intervals look like they're overlapping.
Right. So if I was to go and ask Mr. Mukherjee to carry out a negative binomial on the monthly data, do you think that might be more useful?
I think it's well, yeah. My understanding is that would have been better for over time with lots of zero cases.
I'll see how he's doing. Okay. Do you see anything that takes off the screen? Anything in terms of the Aspergillus rates that shows change or trend? Given, for example, the original chart in the HAD report in Volume 1, page 128 for the children.
I think I had a similar view on that as I had to the bloodstream infection data. Is that there does look like, to me, without trends or analysis, that it does look like there's a period where there was an increased incidence.
So what do we do if we are faced with a situation where this chart sits there and people, you're not the only one, look at that and think, is there something going on after the move? And yet we don't have statistical significance in our trends or charts, potentially because the data is so small. What do we do as a decision maker trying to understand? I mean, do we just ignore this and think there's nothing going on here? Or do we do something else?
So I think the difficulty of this is always going to be that there's no opportunity to discuss what might be going on with these data. So in an IMT, if this graph were presented, there would be lots of discussion about why this might be the case. So I think it needs to be taken in the wider context of all of the other information that's available. As I say, it's one piece of a jigsaw. It would be helpful to understand if the clinicians had views around this graph. I think, like we've got with the much more clinical insight with the bacteremia data than we do with the Aspergillus data.
Now, I'd like to go back to your statement to page 18. We've got two more topics to do. So go to page 18 of your statement, paragraph 27. You raise in this, and completely change the topic, the carrying out of environmental pathogens surveillance pilot. What was the purpose of this pilot?
So the purpose of the pilot is to support the development of a local surveillance system for environmental organisms in high-risk units. So this isn't about us developing a national surveillance system. It's about us trying to work through the way that you would set up a local surveillance system. So as part of that, we have a number of candidate triggers in the data. There's 7. and we're piloting those at the moment. And they are triggers that would help local teams identify trends in their data or areas for concern. So at
Can
the
we
moment,
just put them on the screen so we can connect the two together? This
Yep.
bundle 44, volume 2, page 716.
so there isn't a lot of evidence around what these types of triggers for environmental organisms might be. So there are some organisms that are listed in Appendix 13, but there are some others that we've identified along the way. So boards have asked us previously, how do we identify when we've hit a sort of a trigger point in terms of environmental organisms?
But these were the candidate ones.
Yeah, these are candidate
Right.
ones. So
The reason I started just to make the connect the evidence. The question I was really asking is, if we can take it off the screen, to what extent is these relevant to the work of the inquiry? Is this in some sense a reaction to the Queen Elizabeth events?
Yes, this was a request as part. I think it was from the oversight board actually.
I want to show you a comment in a supplementary statement from Ms. Devine. So this is hearings. This hearing, she's one of the consequential witnesses. We asked her about her experience at York Hill, and took the opportunity to ask some further questions. And this is on page 13 of the 3rd volume of this hearing bundle. Now, I think the issue here relates to the outcome, the impact of a particular SOP that GGC have, and I'll ask Miss Imrie about that. But since this is about the pilot, I'd like to ask you to respond, if you wish, to paragraph 2 of Miss Devine's statement, where she appears to be suggesting, well, what is she suggesting?
So reading this, I think Ms. Devine has read the report and has noticed that there were 60 triggers identified in the. So we had two boards and 3 pilot sites, and at that point we had tried to look to see how many of those triggers had been reported via the outbreak reporting tool.
That's the red, amber, green system.
Yeah. So, and in line with Chapter 3 of the National Manual. So I think what she is saying is that the pilot boards are also identifying. There are situations in the pilot boards that have not been reported to RHI, and I think that's maybe the point that she's trying to make. And she's suggesting that there were 60 of these situations and only 14 reports to RHI. But I think what we need to understand about the triggers is they're not mutually exclusive. So of those 7 triggers that are there, a single incident can meet multiple triggers during the course of the pilot. So it's not a one-to-one relationship. The triggers are not mutually exclusive of each other.
So one of those 14 could have met other triggers as well?
Yeah,
right.
Multiple.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
If we take it off the screen, in fact, so I'll put it back on the screen and go to page 31. The final paragraph of your statement. That's entirely the wrong place. Go to paragraph 31, page 20. You're suggesting that there should be. What's the point you're making about the importance of local reporting here?
So I think this was in relation to the question about whether there should be similar targets or standards for environmental infections like we have for Staph aureus bacteremia, E. coli bacteremia and C. difficile infection. I think that was the question that had been posed to me. And so my response to that is that those infection types that currently have targets associated with them are endemic. So we do want to have targets to reduce, whereas these environmental infections are not endemic, and we need to, there shouldn't be a baseline for us to try and have a target to reduce
Yes.
from. So a better way for us to receive information about these types of alert organisms is via the outbreak reporting tool. That would be the right way in order to report these into the national organisation, and as part of that we are then able to take the learning from it. We get a lot of information in the outbreak reporting tool. We can use that information to collate national intelligence and then share that with boards so that there's a shared learning.
What, as far as as the data person, as it were, what do you see as the value of reporting by boards?
The value of reporting by boards is to enable us, from my perspective, from an epidemiological perspective, we're able to describe outbreak epidemiology. We can, look at trends. We can work out whether there's commonality across the different health boards. From an IPC perspective, there's a lot of information that comes in about the management of the incident, and also lessons learned. And that, as an organisation, is our responsibility to bring that together and make sure that the lessons learned are shared. So it's really important.
Thank you, Ms. Cairns. My Lord, I've asked all the questions I was planning to ask, but I think it'd be necessary to see if any questions in the room and on the video from those whose instructing solicitors are outside the building.
Right. Ms. Cairns, as you've heard Mr. McIntosh explain, he wants to check if there's any other questions which should be asked. Could I ask you to go back to the witness room? I would anticipate that process might take 10 minutes.
Thank you.
Mr. McIntosh.
I just have one question for the witness.
I understand. One more question.
So returning to the environmental pathogens surveillance pilot report, are you able to give us any indication of what the feedback was from those boards that took part in the pilot about what they felt was the value of it?
Yep. So they felt that it was really useful. It helped them identify areas within their unit. What I should say is that two of the boards that participated were actually supporting an incident, an outbreak in those boards as well. So a lot of the information that we were providing to them, they were already aware of because they were investigating incidents in the units. So on top of what they already knew, they felt that this information was additionally helpful to them. Some of the triggers they felt were maybe a little bit sensitive, and that's one of the things that we're looking at as part of the next pilot is we have to get the balance right between the number of triggers that are coming up versus the resource that's available for investigation, because that needs to be balanced. So there's a bit of work around refining some of these triggers.
Is there any, this is probably just from me, is there any issue with having environmental triggers that you need to change them as time passes in order to deal with the pathogen, unlike the standard 3 or standard 4 where you know what they are? Is there any difficulty that you actually have to be flexible to have these sort of triggers, and therefore having a policy makes that harder?
Absolutely. I mean, all of these triggers are really just to sort of prompt investigation rather than being anything other than that. There's lots of reasons why we might need to change the triggers. The size of the unit is one thing. The organism list might change when there might be other environmental organisms. Boards might decide that they want to change, what we're recommending as well based on their own local epidemiology. So these are just a guide, the triggers. They're not about immediately there's a trigger you have to report to RHI. They're different types of triggers.
Is this effectively more a tool than a reporting mechanism?
Yes, I would say so. Yeah.
Thank you very much,
Yeah.
Ms. Cairns.
Ms. Cairns, thank you very much. That is now the end of your evidence and you're free to go. But before you do, can I thank you for your attendance this morning, but also for the quite considerable amount of work that you have clearly done in not only in preparing for your evidence today, but providing responses to the inquiry, to questions directed to NSS. So you're free to go, but you go with my thanks. Thank you. Well, we'll sit again at 2 o'clock when I think Mr. Connell will be taking the evidence of Dr. Chaput.
Dr. Chaput, yes, at 2 o'clock, yes.
Right.